from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu.
President Trump threatens more sanctions against Russia. Welcome to the Wednesday edition as Trump hosts the president of Poland today at the White House. And geopolitics are back on the menu here in Washington, D.C., along with the future of NATO and the war in Ukraine, all in the balance. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kriti Gupta in Washington with much more to cover. Kriti, here we are on day 2 of your stay in the United States with, again, international affairs, foreign policy on the agenda, and a conversation about not only the war in Ukraine, Russia's war, but what's happening right now in China as President Xi appears alongside Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin.
A real show of strength from Asian counterparts that you're starting to see, and getting the global south on board as well at a time when some of Donald Trump's closest allies, in theory, are still working on that defense ramp up. I'm sure that's something that's being talked about with the visit from the Polish president today.
Yeah, they're having lunch right now in the cabinet room with a lot to discuss here. President Trump mentioning the idea of phase 2 or phase 3 secondary sanctions, which is a concept that we're going to chase down coming up with Jeanne Harman, the chair of the National Defense Strategy Commission, but also just crossing the terminal, Kriti. President Trump set to meet with Volodymyr Zelensky on Thursday. And we'll have a live report coming up from the White House on this.
A fascinating time. I believe he's in Paris at the moment speaking to his European counterparts.
We'll have some headlines coming from these conversations, clearly, and much more to follow. We'll check in with Tyler Kendall on the North Lawn in a moment. But first, we want to update Wall Street. Let's get to the markets and the Wednesday trade right now with the help of Lisa Mathieu in New York. Lisa?
You got it, Joe. We have a mix of red and green on the screen. So I want to take a little bit of a closer look under the hood. You head to the IMAP feature of your terminal. Of the 11 major industry groups, the biggest boost is coming from communication services. You click through, it's media entertainment. It goes to interactive media and services. And at the top is Alphabet. Yes, its shares are up more than 8%. That was after the judge ruled that Google can keep control of Chrome, also its partnership with Apple, but has to share some of the search data with rivals. Apple's shares, they're up about 3%. Over to the NASDAQ, it's up 0.9%, 190 points. The S&P 500 rising 0.2%, 15 points. The Dow down 0.4%, or 222 points. The sell-off in government debt lost some momentum. The yield on 30-year treasuries came close to 5% before erasing that advance. We'll start with the 30-year at 4.89%, down 7 basis points. The yield on the 10-year, 4.21%, and that's down 5 basis points. And the 2-year, 3.60%, that's down 3 basis points. The Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index, that's down about 0.2%. We'll take you to earnings now, and starting with Macy's, their shares up nearly 17%. Raised its annual outlook, reported its best comparable sales growth in 3 years. Its CEO said the company's back-to-school season is off to a good start. A different story over at Dollar Tree. Their shares are lower, down about 8%. Discount chain said profit for the current quarter would be little change, but that kind of overshadowed the news that the company actually boosted its annual outlook. And an earnings beat for Campbell's. Its shares are up 5%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now. I'm Lisa Mathieu. That is your Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Lisa, thank you. Live from World Headquarters in New York. We'll get back with Lisa in about 20 minutes to check on Wall Street and the bond market with tariffs in the air and foreign policy. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kriti Gupta in Washington. Thanks for being with us here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. President Trump holding forth on a range of issues alongside the president of Poland, who is visiting the White House today to talk about any number of issues pertaining to our relationship militarily. We had a series of flybys upon the arrival of the president. But of course, it's the strategy with regard to Ukraine and NATO that they were talking about. I will be clear, though, President Trump was asked when reporters were given a chance to bring some questions, asked about a range of issues, from Jeffrey Epstein to tariffs to crime here in Washington and other cities. And we want to get an update right now first from Bloomberg's Washington correspondent Tyler Kendall on the North Lawn of the White House. Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Joe. It was a relatively warm welcome for the Polish president inside the Oval Office. Now the pair of leaders are meeting behind closed doors in the cabinet room. And while President Trump hit on a range of issues when speaking to reporters, it is clear that the war in Ukraine is going to factor heavily into the conversation today. We even heard President Trump suggest that we could see round 2 or 3 of so-called secondary secondary tariffs against our trading partners that import Russian energy supplies. It comes after the Ukrainian President Zelensky had suggested that he will speak with President Trump tomorrow. You mentioned the headline at the top of the show there, and our understanding is he's going to push the U.S. for further economic consequences to hold Russia accountable. Now, the president did highlight the one instance that we have seen of these so-called secondary tariffs, that additional 25% against India. The president said that India is importing almost as much Russian oil as China is. Of course, China is not facing that additional penalty, as the White House says that those trade negotiations are on a totally separate track when it comes to Beijing. I'll point out that our analysts at Bloomberg Economics say that China imports about 47% of Russian crude exports, while India takes about 37% of those Russian crude exports. So a little bit of a difference there. Of course, it comes on the heels of what you've been covering basically all week on Balance of Power, which is that we saw the Indian Prime Minister, Russian President Vladimir Putin, and Chinese President Xi Jinping all meet in China the other day. President Trump did confirm that he was watching. Now, Joe, when it comes to the war in Ukraine, of course, one of the biggest questions still on the table really does have to do with those security guarantees. And perhaps that's why we're seeing this warm relationship between the two leaders meeting today, because the White House has applauded repeatedly how Poland has really upped its defense spending when it comes to contributing to the overall NATO defense spending of that alliance.
Well, Tyler, it feels like in that press conference that the two leaders actually had, the concept of European freeloading came up once or twice. Talk to us a little bit about the sentiment at the White House at the moment when it comes to, in theory, what should be the United States' closest allies in Europe.
Right, and I actually think, Kriti, you're hitting on one of the domestic political dynamics that we're actually seeing play out in Poland when it comes to the Polish president compared to perhaps the more pro-European Union Prime Minister of Poland, Donald Tusk. And actually, we had some pretty incredible reporting earlier today that a Polish official told Bloomberg News that there's concern that a deepening sense of legislative chaos due to this rift could actually hurt investment in Poland. So it's clear that Poland, as of today, this meeting is going to be used as a way to try to show that Poland has the U.S.'s support, potentially here when it comes to growth prospects for Poland going forward. But we know that the EU and the U.S.'s relationship has sort of been a tricky needle for this White House to thread, particularly when it comes to those tariff negotiations. Now, the European Union was able to secure that more preferential rate of 15%, but it didn't come until after really months of back and forth tensions. At one point, we didn't even think that a deal was going to be able to be secured, which is the last headline that I'll leave you with. The President Trump sounded pretty confident that this tariff appeals court case is headed to the Supreme Court, saying that he's watching it closely and he's confident that they'll come out on top.
Tyler, are we done? We had a pretty good exchange there in the Oval Office. They have no other public events. If they strike a deal on anything regarding Ukraine or beyond, will we hear from either president?
Well, at this point, there is nothing that is publicly on the White House schedule. Joe, this meeting, this working lunch in the cabinet room as of now is closed to reporters. But of course, we're going to be watching closely. Often when the foreign leader leaves, he could be given the chance to come to the stick microphones here at the White House that are stationed right outside of the West Wing. But at this point, we're really just watching for those developments, particularly as we try to glean some more details on what these agenda items for the rest of the week will look like, including President Trump meeting with Zelensky, as well as him confirming that he has plans to talk with Russian President Vladimir Putin in the coming days.
Great. Tyler, thank you so much. Live from the White House, Bloomberg's Washington correspondent, Tyler Kendall. Indeed, Vladimir Putin is on President Trump's mind, having seen the images of Putin alongside President Xi and Kim Jong-un. Donald Trump was asked about Vladimir Putin and the war in Ukraine at the beginning of this Q&A. Here's what he said.
I have no message to President Putin. He knows where I stand, and he'll make a decision one way or the other. Whatever his decision is, we'll either be happy about it or unhappy. And if we're unhappy about it, you'll see things happen.
Let's bring in Jeanne Harman on this conversation, a chair of the National Defense Strategy Commission, former ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee. Jeanne, it's great to have you back on Bloomberg TV and radio. We've been talking about this on the regular since Russia invaded Ukraine. Will Donald Trump end up being disappointed in Vladimir Putin?
I have no idea whether he'll be disappointed, but he's been on both sides of this issue for months, and it's time for him to pick a side. And the right side is to stand with Europe. I'm very glad he's meeting with Poland, and to let Lindsey Graham and the Graham-Blumenauer bill pass the Congress. It's overwhelmingly supported, and it would impose secondary sanctions across the board on countries that are dealing in oil with Russia. It's been the right thing to do forever, and Trump is not making the decision. So I'm a little confused, maybe, but disappointed that we keep moving the goalpost over and over and over again. One thing I would say is that the stakes get higher and higher. It's almost the end of summer. When the snow comes, a lot of what Ukraine can do will not work anymore. Drones, yes, but supplies are running low. The U.S. government may close, God forbid, at the end of September because we don't have a budget. And there is still enormous ambivalence in Trump's base about what to do about Ukraine. I'm not ambivalent. Ukraine is a democratic country invaded by Russia. And if Putin gets away with this, he goes straight into Europe. And we just saw that Poland was increasing military drills because there were air attacks in western Ukraine, which is very close to eastern Poland. One more comment. Poland has taken in so many Ukrainian refugees, starting at the beginning and assimilating them. I don't think any other country has been as generous, and we really, really owe a lot to Poland.
Jeanne, you mentioned a key piece there, which is those secondary or even tertiary sanctions when it comes to really targeting who is going to be buying oil from Russia. There are still countries in Europe that are very much dependent on those exports, even 3 years from the war. Could they be on that list of countries at the White House that could face those targets?
Well, I think it'd be hard to exempt them. I mean, there are oil resources available elsewhere, including from the United States. I mean, we've been talking about this forever, oil and fuel resources. And we have a surplus, notwithstanding some of the rhetoric around, and we could expedite shipping some of it to Europe. So I'm not sympathetic. I think this war has to end, but it has to end on Ukraine's terms. One more thing. I read that Putin said he'll meet with Zelensky if Zelensky comes to Russia. That's Zelensky's choice. But why would he do that? Russia's the aggressor in violation of international law and has been every single night killing Ukrainian children and bombing schools and kidnapping hundreds of children. I would think it goes the other way. Putin should be coming to Ukraine and asking for something reasonable.
Jeanne, what did you make of the president's remarks about our troop presence in Poland, knowing that at times the president may have been listening to Vladimir Putin on this issue? Russia would love U.S. troops to be out of Eastern Europe. And he said he has no intention of reducing the number of troops in Poland. Quote, they've always wanted to have a larger presence. We have some countries that have more, not too many. But no, they'll be staying in Poland. Is that a turn based on the way the president is feeling about Vladimir Putin over the past couple of days?
Well, again, this is what he said today. What's he going to say tomorrow? But if it were up to me, darn well keep those troops there. Keep our coordinating base that provides intel and strategy into Ukraine in Germany. I visited it. It's in Wiesbaden, very impressive. And the U.S. is part of NATO. The defense of Europe is part of our commitment. And if we don't defend Europe, I think we leave ourselves vulnerable. And we, again, violate our fundamental values, which are to uphold the rule of law. That's how we win against China and these other countries. We have values. They don't. They're just thugs. And I don't want my country to become like them. I want my country to be the shining city on the hill, which is what Ronald Reagan said it was.
Jeanne, the world's been digesting shocking images coming out of China, not only in terms of warm embraces with Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, among many, many other leaders, but also a very flashy military parade. I'm curious how you think that's being received here in the States. Does that almost justify a show of force, a show of strength here in the States?
Well, again, my point is, renaming the Department of Defense of U.S. values and the U.S. soil, the Department of War communicates the wrong message. We haven't done it yet. I hope we don't do it. Matching widget to widget with China is not going to win. I mean, China's now has a broad appeal around the world, including an economic appeal, to remind we have pulled out of Africa, we have closed and defunded our soft power, including USAID and parts of the State Department. We're reducing our ability to compete with China on using all elements of national power, which was what this Commission on National Defense Strategy recommended. If we just become the war machine, we're going to invite war. And that is exactly not what we should be doing.
You probably saw the president's post on Truth Social as he was watching the parade that Kriti mentions. This was a post aimed at President Xi. Jane Harman, he wrote in part, "Please give my warmest regards to Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un as you conspire against the United States of America." What's the conspiracy?
Well, Putin said Trump has a sense of humor. I thought it was a snide comment. I don't know what was in Trump's head, but I can't imagine, again, that he really means what that says. And he's got to pick a side. Why don't you pick the side of American values and American democracy, which has been so valuable for almost 250 years, not just since World War II, but let's understand people want to come here. They don't want to line up and go to China or Russia. And Russia has devastated its economy by this wrong-headed war. Putin's only alive in this war because he's being bailed out by China and North Korea. They all have nukes. That is very scary. But the right answer is to promote American values. That's how you promote American power. That's how we will win.
Jane, I want to take the conversation back to Ukraine if we can. As you were speaking, we were getting headlines coming from the Elysee, from Emmanuel Macron speaking alongside Vladimir Zelensky in Paris. Emmanuel Macron saying Europeans are ready to provide security guarantees to Kyiv. In your opinion, can the Europeans do it alone?
Well, they can do a lot of it, and I want to salute the leaders of Europe who have not backed down and have consistently taken the right side of this issue. They can do a lot. They can provide troops. They can provide training. They can't provide all the intel that we can provide, but they can, as they have claimed to be doing, I hope they're doing it, use at least the interest from the seized Russian assets to fund military assets into Ukraine. I'm devastated that it turns out the Trump administration has been telling Ukraine for months, not telling us, but it leaked, I guess, a week ago, that those long-term assets, the ATACMS, the long-range missiles, cannot be used to attack Russia. Why can't they? Russia's using military airfields to attack Ukraine. We're not talking about bombing kids in Russia, which is what Russia's doing to Ukraine. We're talking about measures to take out the offensive weapons that Russia is using against Ukraine. So I'm hoping that somehow Europe will be able to help with this and that President Trump will figure out that the right side of this to be on is to keep the commitments that he personally made. And he's meeting with Zelensky, I gather, later this week, and to tell Zelensky, okay, the Lindsey Graham Blumenthal bill is passing. Congress wrote it, and I can't veto it. And this is how we're going to stand with you and prevail for democracy.
Jane, it's great to have you weigh in here. Jane Harman, chair of the National Defense Strategy Commission. Thank you, as ever, for joining us on Bloomberg TV and radio. We've got breaking news coming from the New York Times, a couple of headlines that just crossed the terminal. That brings us back to President Trump and the mayor's race in New York. Yes, they combined here with President Trump mulling roles, we read, for Mayor Eric Adams and Curtis Sliwa to drop their mayoral bids and do something, presumably, for the administration. We'll be pursuing this story as we assemble our political panel coming up next. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino on the way in, right here, only on Bloomberg. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington alongside Kriti. Gupta, thanks for being with us here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. You might have heard President Trump asked about Jeffrey Epstein earlier. It's not only because that is an obsession here in Washington, D.C. The story did advance a bit over the past 24 hours with a petition, a discharge petition, as it's called, filed by a Democrat and Republican, Ro Khanna, the Democrat, Tom Massey, the Republican, to force a vote on releasing the Epstein files. That legislation, that piece of paper was filed yesterday. Today, some 33,000 Epstein files, most of them not new, were released, made public by the Oversight Committee, Republican-controlled in the House. And a news conference was held a short time ago, late morning, with victims of Jeffrey Epstein. And the aforementioned Representative Tom Massey was there. Listen.
The Speaker of the House just offered a fig leaf to my colleagues. They're going to vote on a non-binding resolution today that does absolutely nothing. They're allowing the DOJ to curate all of the information that the DOJ is giving them. If you've looked at the pages they've released so far, they're heavily redacted. Some pages are entirely redacted. And 97% of this is already in the public domain.
97%, Kriti, Gupta. People are waiting for a client list or something. Even in 33,000 pages, they still don't have it.
Yeah, and the victim's saying that maybe they'll put together their own client list as some sort of solution to really reveal it. Really interesting development today as they were taking questions. To be fair, Speaker Johnson did talk about this just yesterday. Here's what the Speaker of the House had to say.
I think we follow the truth where it leads. I think that's the responsibility of Congress. I think we owe that to the victims. And if there are further prosecutions, they need to be brought. No stone unturned. I mean, that's the commitment, and it's bipartisan. And I'm heartened that members of Congress are willing to work together on that. So, and look, I will say this again. I'm going to emphasize this is full participation of the administration and the White House. The president has the same desire, so long as we're protecting the innocent victims.
President Trump was asked about this in his news conference a bit earlier in the Oval Office. He said, quote, "It's really a Democrat hoax. I know that no matter what you do, it's going to keep going." A little bit different tone than we've heard from him in the past, and that's where we start with our political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino are with us. Rick is our Republican strategist and partner at Stonecourt Capital. Jeanne is Democracy Visiting Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center, our Democratic analyst. Jeanne, this is an interesting moment. A Democrat hoax. We've heard those words from President Trump before, but not in the past couple of weeks, as most Republicans have at least given lip service to making these files public. What do you make of his reaction?
It's astonishing because just moments earlier, I watched the press conference that you were all just talking about with these victims, some of whom had been trafficked, abused, raped, sexually assaulted at age 14, 15, 16, their entire lives and their family lives devastated. They stood up there and told these stories and asked the Congress to release these redacted Epstein files. And one of them even said in response to a question, "Mr. President, if you think this is a hoax, come down here and meet me at the Capitol. We are real people." And he has the audacity just moments later to say this is a Democrat hoax, which is language he's only started using in the last few months, because when he was out of office, he was saying, release the files. Let's see how the swamp that is Washington, D.C. and wealthy men have been abusing people. It's his MAGA base that has been calling for this. But once he got into office, he changed his tune. And I'm not sure he's going to be able to get out of this. And by the way, another really astonishing part of this is reports that the White House has been saying that any member of the GOP who votes for this discharge position, they will see it as a hostile act against the president and the White House. That's astonishing language and quite apart from anything the president said when he wasn't in office.
Rick, weigh in here. I mean, as Jeanne just pointed out, this is becoming or emerging, dare I say, is already a very significant wedge between certain members of the House GOP and, of course, the White House. How sustainable is that wedge?
You know, look, I mean, the president has won virtually every battle it's taken to the House of Representatives. These guys have caved like a house of cards over and over and over. They go out and they say, hey, we're not going to vote for another penny of deficit. Boom, they vote for trillions in new deficit. You know, these are just examples of the president getting on the phone and working these guys. And by the way, that's not exclusive to this president. I mean, this happens in virtually every Congress. But I would say the willingness for House Republicans to cave to the president's desires is pretty significant. There are 4 votes right now on the Republican side joining what we think would be 212 votes for the Democratic side to be within 2 votes of having a discharge petition force the House of Representatives to vote. And of course, that's the trickiest vote, is to actually get it on the floor. And there has been some evidence that these threats by both the speaker and the president have started to take its toll on people who otherwise would want to see and have said, like Jeanne said, for years, show us all the records, give us the lists. And they're now, I think, getting cold feet. So this could be one of the big sort of promises to how to deal with the Epstein case, but it may fall flat on its face here in just the next couple of days.
Democrats are finding some interesting ways to get to this. A report in the Washington Post, Jeanne, Senator Ron Wyden says the Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, is withholding key information that could help to illuminate the finances of Jeffrey Epstein. Directly, he said, Bessent is, quote, directly responsible for the decision to withhold the Epstein files from Congress. Will your party find new ways outside of a discharge petition to bring these public?
I think that the Democrats and I think Republicans, because remember, this has long been a call from the Republican side. It is the MAGA base that has been calling for this, and Democrats have certainly jumped on board with that. But I think regardless of what happens with this petition, it will go forward. And it's so fascinating, Joe, that you mentioned this about the Treasury Secretary, because one of the things we heard from the victims and their attorneys was the complicity along the way, not just of Epstein and Maxwell in terms of the initial perpetrators, but how they have been victimized over and over again in this process by the people who run our law enforcement officials, attorneys generals, and the like. And that includes some of the big financial houses in our country that they said had been, and we don't have all this information, had been allowing, as they put it, Epstein to pull enormous amounts of money and to pay these young women in cash and turned a blind eye. And that's why we saw some of the, they had been able to recoup some of that. So there is a lot of complicity to go on here. And the economics, the financial end of this is very, very real. And I suspect, if, as Kriti was talking about, they do put together a list and at some point that is released, we may see names among that, not just perpetrators, but people who covered up in some of these crimes.
Certainly a critical and heartbreaking issue. Rick, put a little bit of this into context for us when it comes to some of the other issues that are maybe plaguing Washington at the moment. Talk to us about how some of these kind of developments on these Epstein files, how people could potentially vote when it comes to this discharge petition, if it's put to the floor. Does that bleed into some of these other talks when it comes to shutdown fears, when it comes to other pieces of legislation?
Kriti, you nailed it. This is a real distraction to the leadership in both the House and Senate. They have a lot of work to get done in order to be able to fund the government by the 30th of September. And there seems to be no real public process that's taking place right now to do that. Normally, you have a four corners meeting. The leaders of the Republican and Democratic Party in both the Senate and the House get together and start working on what the numbers are going to look like, what are the process going to be, because it takes time to work both through the Senate and the House to get, if in this case, a continuing resolution done before the end of this month. And this is taking up a lot of bandwidth, as we've seen today. The entire Hill has been abuzz with press conferences and threats to vote and meetings in the basement of the Capitol, with the Republican caucus, and none of this is getting done toward actually fixing the budget pressure that we're under, by the end of the month. So yes, there's no end to this in sight, that being the Epstein file, but there is a burning deadline for the government to fund itself, and that seems to not be given the attention that it really deserves.
The deadline that hits in 28 days, Jeanne, I believe that's 13 legislative days. And so it's going to have to be a CR. Obviously, we're not going to pass 12 budget bills between now and then. The question is, how long would the CR be? And granted, we're allowing for a potential shutdown. A lot of people think that might happen. But the White House is now talking about, at least according to reports today, a year-long CR. We touched on this yesterday. Would fund federal agencies until the first quarter of 2026. Can Donald Trump pull that off? Is that how this ends?
They certainly would like to see that. And, you know, they've been talking about this, and you just mentioned there's been rumblings from the White House of a clean CR, and they would like it to go into 2026. Can he pull it off? I would be crazy to say he can't, because he's pulled off a lot legislatively already. The problem he has here is they really desperately need Senate Democrats. And so they're going to have to deal with Senate Democrats. And that is going to be the big question in my mind. Will Senate Democrats deal with them? Because, of course, again, we're talking about the MAGA base with the Epstein files. It is the Democratic base when it comes to this CR. They are the ones who don't want Democrats dealing with Trump and the Republicans at all. Don't give them an inch. So that's going to be, I think, the big question. What do the Democrats do? And as Rick was saying, what does the leadership do?
Rick, is Jeanne right there? Does Donald Trump, for lack of a better term, do they need the Democrats, or can Republicans do it alone when it comes to getting some sort of solution for the budget?
Well, you need the Democrats in the Senate. You don't need them in the House. The House could do a party line vote, get all the Republicans to march down and vote on a continuing resolution with numbers that are generated just by Republicans. But in the Senate, you need cloture in order to take a budget bill to the floor. And that requires 60 votes, which means, you need a handful of Democrats to make up the difference. And that has been the sticking point. That's why people are worried about a government shutdown, because if the Democrats in the Senate don't feel like their concerns are being addressed in this continuing resolution or any future deals that they want to cut about rescission bills or future reconciliation bills that don't require their votes, then they could hold things up. And that's really where the action will be. Unlike usually these budget fights are taken down to the floor of the House, right now, the real sticking point for this could be getting that funding done by September 30th through the Senate.
Well, Rick's talking about the math, which we cannot deny here when it comes to the House, Jeanne. But we did hear from Hakeem Jeffries on the messaging for Democrats leading up to a potential CR or shutdown. Here's what the Democratic leader in the House said.
We're not going to find ourselves in a situation where Republicans at the 11th hour present a partisan spending bill that hurts everyday Americans, hurts children, hurts veterans, hurts seniors, and hurts the very people who this government should be helping. And then Republicans expect that we are just going to fall in line like they do all the time to Donald Trump's extreme agenda. That's not happening.
Well, he says it's not happening, Jeanne, but this could blow up in Democrats' faces pretty easily here, right? People aren't sitting at home talking about rescissions or the many things that have broken down trust between Democrats and Republicans on Capitol Hill. Is it a sure thing that the majority party in this case would be blamed for a shutdown?
Nothing is sure. I wouldn't say that. But I do think there is more will at this point on the Democratic side, particularly in the base, to stand up against the GOP, particularly as the minority leader just mentioned, if in fact they are pushing for policies that don't take into account the interests of the poor, the working class, and other constituencies important to the Democrats. And so I do think that Democrats feel more emboldened after having gone along with Republicans last time under Schumer to push back. They could be on the losing side of that, by the way, and pay for it. But I think there's more fear in Democrats on the Hill today that, in fact, if they go in the other direction and they do work with the Trump administration and the GOP, and they do act in the way Schumer did last time, that they'll pay a bigger price, particularly in the midterm. So I think it's anybody's bet whether they are, in fact, ready to play ball.
All right. Rick, what's more likely here at this point? An actual CR that keeps the government open, or a discharge petition that brings the release of the Epstein files?
Well, I would say for sure the government's going to get funded at some point in time. I really don't think it's in either party's interest to see the government shut down. Republicans on their watch don't want it, and Democrats really don't win by having this. You're talking about the greatest demagogue of our time being in the White House. You would not want to be a Democrat thinking somehow you're going to win in an argument on this one with him. And so I do think that's likely to occur, even if it's a last-minute deal. But the Epstein thing, look, I give Trump enormous credit for having wrangled the House Republicans over and over and over again to meet his requirements, and I have absolutely no doubt that he'll do this again. In this case, I do think he stands some risk of injuring his own political credibility by doing it.
Well, just want to let our listeners and viewers know that we're going to bring you shortly an important conversation live from Boston. The mayor, I should say the governor of Massachusetts. I should stick with the state, not the city, although they are in Boston. Maura Healey is going to be here for an important conversation with Bloomberg in just a couple of moments. And it's important in part, Jeanne, because there was a big headline about Massachusetts today that came from the White House. The Trump administration is planning to reconsider a permit and may well, in fact, yank approval of a large wind farm off the coast of Massachusetts. The Interior Department, of course, would be in charge of this, intends to review the project's approval issued in the closing days of the Biden administration. We know a lot about Donald Trump's aversion to wind. Is this something that he can kill from the White House?
Yeah, I think he likely could. I'm certain there'll be a fight over it. It is not a big shock given to your point, his aversion to it. But I am so curious to hear what Governor Healey has to say about it. She is a fascinating up-and-coming star, I think, in the Democratic Party, and she's been a fascinating governor, and she is a very moderate voice in the Democratic Party.
The Interior Department, Rick, is asking a federal court to pause the city of Nantucket's challenge here to South Coast wind development, since the Trump administration intends to ask that the matter be sent back to the Interior Department. It's a bit of procedural legalese, a little bit of muck there. But in this filing, the administration is looking for the court to rule on this so-called voluntary demand request. Is this the end of wind energy as we know it in America?
Well, if you listen to President Trump, he certainly has been railing about it, blaming bird strikes and all other sorts of aesthetic issues against it. And look, I mean, to me, this is all about the businesses that were created over the last 2 decades to actually give us renewable energy. What are they going to do if this gets canceled? They've invested hundreds of millions of dollars in these projects, and the government's going to pull the rug out from under them. Are they going to be compensated for their losses? I doubt it. We're going to have another lawsuit against the federal government. What do we need that for? So I think the incredible disruption that occurs by taking these things out of useful purpose, especially when they are getting toward the end of their development period, is just needless. I struggle to understand the economic reasons why this would be the case.
Well, it's a pleasure to have reaction from the governor of Massachusetts now as we thank Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, Bloomberg Politics contributors, for a great panel and conversation today. Maura Healey now in conversation with Caroline Gage, Bloomberg News, head of Americas. This is live from the city of Boston on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Here's the important thing. It's not just jobs in those areas, in research, in science, in life sciences, for example. It's all the other jobs that go with it, because 2 out of every 5 jobs in those areas are actually jobs in construction, in real estate, in legal IP operations, in hospitality, in restaurants. And so, you know, that's why those cuts are particularly devastating to a state like Massachusetts. But, you know, we could talk about what I'm doing to combat that, but that is certainly something that we're seeing. The other thing that's been hard for us is that we're a state where, as governor, I am very focused on lowering costs for residents, for businesses. That includes energy costs. One thing we don't need is energy supply to our region cut off. And unfortunately, that's what we're seeing by the Trump administration's move to kill jobs and to literally take away power by dismantling wind operations on the East Coast.
Yes, and we're going to absolutely get to wind. But before we get there, I just did want to talk about what you've been doing to combat the threat that these funding cuts pose to the state. You've proposed using $400 million in state funding to help combat that. How far does that go?
Well, here's the thing, okay? I think this is a good investment. even without what is happening by the Trump administration, but especially because of the cuts that we're seeing. I want to be clear, as governor of this great state of Massachusetts, we're open to the world for business. We want to continue to be the place that attracts students and researchers from around the country, from around the world. We want to attract entrepreneurs and innovators, as we have for so many decades. And, part of my statement in coming forward with DRIVE, which stands for Discovery, Research, Innovation for a Vibrant Economy, the whole point is to say we're making these investments because we know the ROI. We've seen it in life sciences, and that's why we're not just #1 in the country, we are the global hub for life sciences. And when you think about climate technology or applied AI, or even further work that we can do in life sciences, these are the kinds of investments that we need to make. So that's $400 million in state funding that we hope to leverage with additional funding from, I'm a big believer.
Yes,
I'm a team player and public-private partnership. That's what we are embracing more than ever. So obviously we have a venture community, we have a life sciences community, we have an academic community, we have an investment community, people who know and understand what it means to make an investment and see a great return. And so we're hoping to be able to leverage that and really be a model. I don't know of a state that's doing this, but it's that important. By the way, not just to Massachusetts. It's important to this country because the only one who's winning right now is China. China's on our campuses in Massachusetts and around the United States, at our research institutions, at our teaching hospitals, looking to recruit everyone away. You've seen that, you've covered that, and that's the shame of it all. I am about America first. I'm a very competitive person. I want Massachusetts soaring, and I want America soaring. And one thing we shouldn't be doing is not investing in science and research and innovation and ceding that, essentially, to China and other countries.
Yes, just to go a little bit deeper into that public-private initiative that you've proposed, can you give us a window into how much interest have you received in actually putting money into this, and why should individuals or businesses put money in a state-administered fund?
Well, look, I'm the CEO of the state, and my job is to be the best economic steward that I can be for this state. And that means making sure that we are maximizing the return on taxpayer dollar. It also means making sure that I am working inside and outside of government to provide the best economic infrastructure that I can. It's why I've gone big, investing in education in this state, and including a whole pipeline, K-12 and beyond. It's also why I think there's a recognition by folks in the private sector that it is our economic infrastructure at stake. And that's why we all need to come together and figure out a way to power through this time, I think, through new and innovative partnerships that not only will sustain us through this time, but really put Massachusetts where it should be, which is right at the front, nationally, globally, when it comes to attracting talent. Again, my message to the world is, Massachusetts, we're open for business. Yep. We want you to continue to come here, study here, research here, innovate here, incubate here, and grow your companies here. And we have provided and have sought to provide an environment that's conducive to that by providing a pipeline of workforce. We have the most educated workforce in the country, by making major improvements to a public transit system, which is important, to producing more housing so that employees can actually afford to live in a place like Massachusetts. These are things that I think are very important to the private sector, and why we've seen energy and synergy around this kind of collaboration.
So do you have just so I know, do you have a dollar sort of figure in mind that you'd like to raise for that, or how are you thinking about its potential size and impact?
Well, these are big numbers, right? But if you think about Massachusetts alone, we probably have received per capita the largest amount of NIH funding over the years. It's about $3.3 billion. So we're talking about big numbers. And it's not to say that we'll be able to sort of make up for all of that. But I think that if we can smartly and nimbly come together and make the right investments together, the public sector and the private sector will be able to do something very special.
So I said I'd come back to wind, which you brought up. The Trump campaign, their campaign against wind, there was additional developments today with the proposal to stop the development of projects in your state. This past week, you joined other Democratic governors in a joint statement calling for the administration to allow permitted offshore wind projects to proceed. What was the reaction to that statement after you put it out?
Well, I guess we're sort of waiting to see, but all of us are in the strongest possible terms urging the Trump administration to stop with this, to stop with the stop work orders, to stop killing jobs, to stop cutting off power. I mean, literally, when we were hearing word that there might be a stop work order down the entire East Coast, that was incredibly concerning for all of us governors. For me, I had the concern, not only was it going to kill thousands and thousands of jobs, it was also going to literally shut off power to 200,000 homes and businesses, because our wind project is already producing power into the grid. And so that just doesn't make any sense. And, I am somebody, I've been very public about this. I support an all of the above approach when it comes to energy, to do what we need to do. And as somebody who spent $100 million to create an applied AI hub here in Massachusetts, when you think about what our energy needs are as a country, they're just expanding exponentially. It's why we need nuclear and solar and hydro and wind and gas. So don't take wind off the table. We desperately need it. And that's why you saw so many governors come together. Not only is it a matter of jobs, because we're talking about so many jobs, so many construction jobs, so many union jobs. There's been a lot of investment in this workforce, actually, to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. Don't let that go to waste. And most importantly, don't shut off power into a region that needs it. The other thing, of course, is this: more power, more supply, lower costs. Everybody across America is dealing with the high cost to energy. So what do you not want to do in the face of that? You don't want to shrink supply, right? And so that's why we continue to advocate for this most strongly. But, you think about the companies at the top of the index, right? And you think about, the needs of tech right now. And in particular, I think about a state like ours where, we're looking to do so much powered through technology. The energy supply as a country, there should be a concerted effort to get every state in the country working to work together. Some states may be better for gas. Some states may be better for nuclear. Some states may be better situated for solar arrays or hydro or geothermal. By the way, I want to explore all in Massachusetts. But it seems to me leadership from the president and the administration would look like figuring out a plan to source more energy into this country, to build out the transmission lines so that power can actually flow, so that we have a reliable and truly independent source of energy for Americans.
Earlier this year, Bloomberg reported that in New York, Governor Hochul got the feds to lift a stop work order on the Empire Wind project in exchange for dropping opposition to new gas pipelines in the state. Do you think there's scope for a similar deal in Massachusetts?
Well, I think we've already talked about that. I mean, that's already known, but that there's a willingness to do that. But that's sort of, not enough. I mean, what we really need to do is have a comprehensive, concerted strategy where the federal government is working with states, not against states, in an effort to bring more power on board, right? That's what we should be doing. And that's what I just, really urge the Trump administration to get back to. It makes no sense. Wind is, I don't understand where some of this is coming from, this antipathy towards wind. We see wind. I mean, look at so many of the states out west. I mean, they've been long using wind. We need to continue to do that here and to harness it here. It's a tremendous source for us. It's not the only source, which is why, I'm going to continue to work in partnership with other governors. It's also why months ago I invited all the premiers down from Canada, and what can we work out, this region and the eastern provinces, in terms of sourcing more energy into our regions.
So just to be clear, as part of your all of the above approach to energy, you would be supportive of new gas pipelines in Massachusetts?
I'd consider any proposals that come our way. In fact, Eversource, one of our utility companies, just filed a proposal for 10 years that, I personally support, because we need some near-term solves to the supply issue that we have right now in the Northeast. And again, this is an issue that we see across America, but I think it's particularly acute for the Northeast region of the country.
So at the same time, the state does have some pretty ambitious goals in terms of cutting its emissions. Do you have a plan B for renewable energy if Trump's opposition to wind doesn't really budge?
Look, I have been, I think as governor, I was the first governor to name a climate chief across her administration. I'm very mindful of that. It's why I was invited by then Pope Francis to the Vatican to talk about how we could work both through national and subnational relationships on addressing some of these issues. That said, I am acutely focused right now on the issue of costs. Costs for our ratepayers, our residents, our businesses. And how do you deal with that? You deal with that by getting more supply into the region. And I think the good news here is that there are a lot of different ways to do that, to accomplish that, that also make use of a clean energy portfolio that is proven to work, and the prices are coming down on that. So don't take that off the table. I mean, there's a reason why China is building multiple wind farms right now, right? We already see them in Europe, for example. So we know this is part of the solution. Other countries are recognizing it. Don't take this away. Again, if you care about American competitiveness, right, and we want to have AI, and we want to have these data centers, and we want to see this kind of growth, you're not going to be able to do anything if you take power away from these sources. I think about Virginia.
Massachusetts Governor Maura Healey speaking live in Boston here on Bloomberg TV and radio with her own Caroline Gage. We'll meet you back here on the late edition of Balance of Power, 5 p.m. Eastern, with another voice from Massachusetts, Senator Elizabeth Warren, also Republican Byron Donalds, only on Bloomberg.